Derek Walcott, welcome to the interview. You were the Nobel Literature Laureate in 1992. Tell us, where did it all start? What unique combination of circumstances gave Derek Walcott to the world?
I'm from the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean, in the Lesser Antilles, the lower part of the archipelago, which is a bilingual island, French, Creole, and English. But my education is in English. I went to St. Mary's College. I was writing from a very, very early age. My father used to write. He died early. And my mother was a school teacher. So the background is, my academic background from childhood is a strong one, a good one.
And your ancestry, is it typical of the Caribbean?
Yeah, mixed African and Dutch and English, which is prototypical of the Caribbean. Everybody's got some mixture of something.
And what does that bring to the culture? What does that bring to you as a writer?
Well, St. Lucia, which is where I'm from, changed hands from treaties about 13 times. So it might have finished off as a French as opposed to an English island. It's just the last treaty that made it English. Like Martinique, which is its neighbor, or Guadeloupe. Well, what that does is it gives you a bilingual situation, a bicultural situation. Very strong African presence is there in terms of the rituals, Catholic religion, African rituals. The music is very strongly influenced by African rhythms, so on. But of course, one studied English literature, so all that melange was very fertile for me.
There is a contradiction in the perception of your culture.
The usual thing is to see the Caribbean mainly as a tourist place with hotels and waiters and stuff like that. And that's its economic direction, unfortunately, that it has to develop tourism as an industry. So there's a cliche perception of the Caribbean as a place of, usual thing, calypso and steel band and beaches and so on. All of that's there, and it's true. There isn't much interest, though, I think, in the real Caribbean, which is small and negligible in a way. So it's the Caribbean writers and artists who have made attention happen to the Caribbean, that aspect of the Caribbean, not just the tourist aspect of it.
This is a recurring theme in your writing.
No. The risk that it takes is it takes the risk of humiliation and embarrassment. In other words, if you're insisted on as someone who should always be hospitable, always smiling for tourists and so on, that's like a given role that is a kind of more benign slavery in a sense, So there's a big risk of thinking of the Caribbean as a tourist resort, encouraged in a way by government policy of hospitality, but hospitality can be almost taken too far sometimes. So one has to look out that there isn't a kind of degradation in that kind of service. I don't think it's that bad, but I think it's risky. And of course, a lot of the real estate that happens in terms of hotels is often encouraged by the government at the risk of, say, neglecting the needs of the Caribbean people in terms of the villages that are near to beaches, the big hotels that are near to poverty. It takes a very delicate balance for it to work.
You write very lyrically, very beautifully, the landscape of the Caribbean. You describe it very, very well, but there's always this tension. So does that give you fertile ground for your writing, this dichotomy, this tension?
Yes, because, again, it's the smallness of the places that you write, especially in my island, can lead to a very isolated view of oneself. In other words, a fisherman, say, working on a beach doing his job, may be photographed by a tourist because it's photogenic to see him working. And the Caribbean is extremely photogenic, so poverty is photogenic. And a lot of people are photographed in their poverty. And sometimes it's kind of exploited. The poverty can be exploited sentimentally in terms of presenting certain images that are good for tourism, happy native woman holding up something, smiling waiter, all of those sort of cliches that one has to avoid. I think it's almost the duty of the writer to protect the people from that kind of cliche exploitation of them.
In the Caribbean, do you have a readership?
I don't think poetry has a readership anywhere, really, that's that big. If you go to, say, a poetry reading at the Guggenheim Museum or the YMHA, the full audience might be something like 400, 500. Well, you take a place like New York with so many million, that percentage of people attending a poetry reading is very, very small. And proportionally talking, in terms of having a poetry reading in the Caribbean, in which you may have 100 people, percentage-wise, there are more people at that poetry reading in the Caribbean than there are at the Guggenheim.
You published very early, you wrote very early. Do you consider yourself a natural writer?
I always knew what I wanted to do, which was to write poetry from young, very young, and then later plays. So I knew my vocation extremely early, mainly because, I think because of my father's death, early death, and my mother's encouragement. My dedication to trying to be a poet started very, very young, and I was very well encouraged by good teachers and by older friends and so on. So I think it is a benediction, and I also think it is a calling, a duty. For me, it was definitely that's the only thing I knew I wanted absolutely to do from extremely early. So that I thought I was blessed as well, too, in the fact that I was living in a society that hadn't had much expression, particularly in terms of English verse. So it was tremendous excitement to paint and to write that early in trying to find out, who you were, what you're trying to write about, or who your people that you're living among are.
And what developed and nurtured your literary voice?
Well, my mother was extremely encouraging because she knew my father wrote. My father used to have amateur theatricals done in which my mother was an actress, evidently, and his friends and so on. So he had a very small coterie of people devoted to poetry and theater and stuff like that. So she knew it wasn't a surprise to her that I would want or my brother to pursue that calling, to try to be a writer in the Caribbean at that age and at that time was extremely, well, not courageous, but a little odd to say, in St. Lucia that you wanted to be a writer when there are no publishing houses and no museums or galleries and so on. But it was good to do it because you were beginning something. You were at the start of something, I thought.
And further to that stimulus, to the stimulus at home and from within your community, a lot of your writing has very sort of deep classical allusions. You've written the Odyssey. You've reinterpreted it in your writings. What academic career did you pursue?
I have to always defend this idea that I rewrote the Odyssey. I think it would be a stupid endeavor to try to do that. So that's not what it is. It's a book that has to do with references. In other words, our references to the classics or to religion or to anything is referential. It is not the direct thing. I mean, our names, our customs and so on came over the Atlantic. And the fact that the Atlantic has an archipelago called the Caribbean, and that the Aegean has an archipelago called the Aegean, those are geographical parallels. They're not cultural parallels. But any fisherman out at sea is an Odysseus, and any sort of heroic figure on a beach is a Hector.